Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Do you believe that even in an international court, there's still room for arrogance disguised as authority? Then brace yourself, because this story is about to turn everything upside down. It's not an exaggeration or dramatic fiction. It's the kind of narrative that reveals how prejudice, even in the most respected institutions, still wears a suit and speaks with a cultured accent. And it was right inside the International Court of Justice in The Hague that a silent yet powerful lesson was delivered, not with shouting, not with protests, but with posture, presence, and strategic brilliance. Amara Johnson entered the courtroom quietly, not seeking attention. Her badge read Official Translator. Her black skin, her hair tied in a simple bun, her modest clothing with no designer labels, everything about her was read as support staff, and that's exactly how the European Chief Judge treated her, with coldness. No good morning, no eye contact, no attempt at kindness. Amara sat down, organized her documents, and waited for instructions. But in that courtroom, it wasn't language that needed translating. It was arrogance. You've seen this scene before, right? That person who underestimates, ignores, or treats someone as invisible, only to later realize they made a monumental mistake. Well, this is one of those stories, but with a key difference. Amara wasn't just a translator. She was a UN judge, sent undercover to evaluate institutional behavior and respect for diversity within the court. And the chief judge, unaware of this, exposed everything she was supposed to hide. The most remarkable part? Amara didn't need to say a word. She simply did what she always did, performed her job with skill, translated speeches with precision, and followed protocol. But little by little, her brilliance began to shine through the cracks of formality. A clarification here, a subtle correction there, a legal citation delivered naturally, until one diplomat asked aloud, "Excuse me, what's your background?" The room froze. Amara took a breath and calmly replied, "I hold a PhD in international law from Yale. I currently serve as a UN observer judge." That's when the looks changed. The same people who had ignored her now stared in astonishment. The chief judge, once proud and aloof, turned pale. And it wasn't just shame, it was fear of what this could mean. Because this story made it clear that the problem wasn't clothing or job titles. It was the mindset of those who believe power is defined by appearance. Of those who think prestige comes from a designer purse rather than a life's journey. You might think, but this was an isolated case, right? Unfortunately, no. This story is just one of many that expose how subtle discrimination still governs many places of power. The difference here is that the response came from within. Amara didn't shout, didn't demand. She let her legacy speak for itself. And that's what made people uncomfortable. The fact that her dignity didn't need a stage, only space. Behind the scenes, the episode caused an uproar. The UN requested a full report on the chief judge's conduct. The hearing, which had been broadcast live, began circulating online. Thousands of comments asking, how many other Amaras have been ignored? How many voices were silenced before they were even heard? The embarrassment was inevitable, but necessary. Because some stories don't appear to punish, they appear to reveal. And here's the most powerful part. Amara never sought the spotlight. She sought diagnosis. Her role was to observe, document, report. But ironically, she was treated as inferior precisely because she performed that role with excellence. That contradiction exposed the core problem. Institutions claim to value diversity, but still fail to recognize it when it walks in through the front door, unannounced and without a European surname. After the incident, Amara was invited to speak at a global conference on ethics and representation. Standing before jurists from around the world, she opened her speech with a simple yet unforgettable sentence: "The respect you offer says more about you than about the other person." And it is on that respect that justice stands, or collapses. Standing ovation. Tears in the audience. Because some stories aren't just accounts, they're mirrors. And if you've made it this far, you might be asking, what should we do with a story like this? The answer is simple but profound. Reflect, observe, question the spaces you occupy. Who is being heard? Who is being ignored? Could it be that, without realizing, you're acting just like the chief judge, only recognizing value when it's attached to a prestigious diploma? Because deep down, this story is about all of us, about our daily choices, about what we decide to see, and what we choose to overlook. So the next time you cross paths with someone too simple by your standards, remember Amara. Remember how a black woman, made invisible by protocol and institutional racism, became the center of the conversation without raising her voice. Remember how the best stories don't need special effects, just courage. The courage to break patterns, challenge expectations, and exist with dignity, even when the world tries to erase you. Because in the end, true justice isn't revealed through verdicts, but through actions. And every time a story like this is told, a piece of that system begins to change, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, but always with impact. And you, will you just watch, or be part of the change? She walked into the room as if carrying the weight of the world on her back, yet never lost her poise. Amara Johnson was the official translator at that hearing in The Hague. Black skin, modest clothes, watchful eyes. The chief judge barely looked up at her, as if she were just another anonymous staffer. And if you've heard stories like this before, you know, sometimes prejudice doesn't scream. It whispers through cold smiles. That's the danger. When institutional disrespect dresses itself in formality, many don't even notice. The judge didn't insult her or mistreat her outright. She simply treated her as invisible. A subtle slip, but full of meaning. How many stories of great talent are silenced in environments like this, just because someone judged by appearance? If you work in a place like that, pay attention. The biggest issue might not be what's said, but what's ignored. And Amara noticed. She caught every side glance, every needless interruption, every just do your job and don't interfere. But she stood firm, because those who know their worth don't need to shout. They just wait for the right moment to show it. And that moment was about to arrive. After all, some stories just need a small crack to become turning points. On the surface, Amara was just an efficient translator, composed, calm, professional. But behind that discreet badge, there was far more than anyone in that room imagined. She was a UN international judge, a specialist in human rights and racial equality, with decades of experience in courts where nations' destinies are decided. This wasn't just another story of resilience. It was one that forces us to rethink what we call authority. And despite all her credentials, she chose silence over spectacle. Amara didn't demand special treatment or announce her title with flair. She chose to observe. That takes a kind of strength few possess. The strength to not need to prove anything to anyone. In a world obsessed with appearances, that's almost a quiet rebellion. And let's be honest, someone who speaks 7 languages and still listens more than they speak carries a rare kind of wisdom, the kind that shapes the most powerful stories. While the chief judge sat comfortably on her pedestal, Amara was there for a greater purpose, to observe the trial from another perspective, without interfering, for now. It was as if she were holding a truth in her pocket, the kind that changes everything when revealed. And by choosing anonymity, she was already teaching something. Sometimes the most powerful people aren't the loudest. They're the ones who know exactly when to reveal themselves. And that moment was approaching. There comes a time when silence weighs more than 1,000 words. For Amara, that moment came after being interrupted for the 3rd time, without reason, without justification, purely at the whim of someone who thought they held all the power. She took a deep breath, lifted her eyes, and there, in a room full of diplomats, judges, and journalists, she decided to reveal who she truly was. One firm, elegant sentence turned the tide. "Excuse me, Your Honor. Before anything else, I'd like to introduce myself as a judge with the United Nations." The impact was immediate. The room, once thick with disdain, was now submerged in an almost awkward silence. Eyes met, phones stopped buzzing, and even the chief judge was left speechless. And look, it wasn't just about the title. It was about everything that Revelation stood for. The dismantling of a structure, the collision of 2 worlds, the world of institutional arrogance and the world of concealed competence. One of those stories that can move even those who've never been touched by the idea of justice. There, in front of everyone, Amara didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to exist. Her presence spoke louder than any defense. And for a few moments it was as if the entire courtroom had to rethink its own role. How many other Amaras had walked through there unnoticed? How many stories had been shelved before they had the chance to bloom? And more importantly, what happens when the truth decides to stand up and take the floor? What few knew, and many found out too late, was the weight behind the name Amara Johnson. Not out of vanity, but merit. Ph.D. in international law from the University of Geneva. She had served on peacekeeping missions, drafted opinions for multilateral treaties, and participated in the Global Justice Commission. Her name was on rulings that changed the course of nations. It was the kind of resume that makes anyone think twice before underestimating. And even so, she chose silence, until the truth could speak for itself. These are the stories that defy the logic of status. Instead of collecting titles like medals, Amara collected causes, and she made a point of reminding everyone that her degrees didn't distance her from her roots. They strengthened her. She gave lectures in underserved communities, authored books that became academic references, and mentored generations of black jurists around the world. She was living proof that one can sit at the highest tables without forgetting where they came from. And that, surprisingly, still unsettles a lot of people, because it disrupts comfortable narratives. Here's the detail that matters. While many crave recognition for what they have, she chose to be respected for what she built, and she built a lot. In fact, listing her academic contributions to international forums would take longer than an entire hearing. But what truly stood out was how she wielded all of it, with ease, without arrogance, without imposition. Because when competence is real, it stands on its own, and plants the seeds for new stories to grow. It didn't take long for footage of that hearing to go global. Someone in the audience had discreetly recorded the moment of revelation, and within 24 hours, Amara was making headlines in international media, not because of scandal, but because of the elegance with which she exposed a wound so many pretend not to see, prejudice disguised as protocol. Legal scholars, activists, influencers, and even ambassadors began commenting on the case. It was like striking a match in a dark room, one flash of light revealing just how many shadows still linger in our institutions. That's how some stories come to mark generations. The ripple effect was so intense that the video reached the corridors of the UN itself, sparking heated discussions across multiple departments. Emergency conferences were held, conduct reports were reopened, and even neutral organizations demanded official responses. What seemed like an isolated incident became a reflection of what many black professionals face daily, even in high-level positions. Amara wasn't the exception. She was the symbol. And when well placed, symbols can rewrite entire stories. Within days, hashtags bearing her name flooded social media. Universities began using her case in ethics and representation courses. Even television series and film producers expressed interest in adapting the narrative. It was proof of how hungry the world is for authentic, not just symbolic, representation. When a black woman speaks up in an international courtroom and becomes a global headline, it's not just justice being done, it's memory being made. And memories like these, they don't fade. With international pressure mounting, the Hague Tribunal had no choice but to act. The chief judge, once so confident in her posture, was officially reprimanded by the disciplinary committee and temporarily removed from her duties. The reasoning was clear: conduct incompatible with the principles of equity and institutional respect. But the message the world received was even more powerful. When even the most respected courts begin to reassess their actions, it's a sign that something profound is shifting. It's in those turning points that great stories find their plot twist. It didn't stop there. In response to the incident, the court launched a complete review of its internal protocols. New guidelines were established, focusing on training judges and staff to identify and combat implicit bias. Workshops on diversity, empathy, and active listening became mandatory. It may seem small, but changes like this slowly realign the very foundations of power. And that's exactly where we see how a single story can shake structures across borders. What began as a moment of disdain became a regulatory milestone. Embassies updated their diplomatic manuals, NGOs requested hearings with multilateral bodies, and even heads of state cited the case in official speeches. It wasn't just about punishing one individual, it was an institutional wake-up call, a reminder that prejudice, even when hidden, comes at a high cost, and ignoring it can cost far more than just a judge's reputation. As the response grew, something even more valuable began to emerge: conversation. Law schools, legal forums, and academic spaces started deeply engaging with the episode. After all, how many Amaras were ignored before someone hit record, and how many still are? The question echoed across social networks and university halls. Are we truly ready to recognize competence where we least expect it? These stories are mirrors, and mirrors don't lie. They just show what many refuse to see. The reflection wasn't confined to the legal field. Black professionals from various industries began sharing similar experiences, interviews where they were dismissed, meetings where their input was ignored, promotions that never came. It was like opening a box that had always been there, locked tight, and seeing someone like Amara at the center of the conversation gave many the courage to speak up, to exist more firmly, to ask for less permission, and claim more rightful space. And so, individual stories began to merge into something greater, a movement. With that, invitations began to pour in. Renowned universities, NGOs, international organizations, they all wanted to hear from Amara, but not as a symbol of scandal. They wanted to hear her as a strategist, a thinker, a voice of authority. She began leading discussions on representation, meritocracy, and structural justice. And she didn't just speak, she trained leaders, built bridges, and inspired young people. Because what turns a story into a legacy isn't what it exposes, but what it builds after the impact. At the height of her visibility, Amara was invited to speak at the United Nations headquarters, not as a translator, nor as an interim judge, but as a leader. In front of a room filled with international authorities and representatives, she didn't read a cold speech. She spoke from the heart. When prejudice speaks loudly, our dignity must speak louder. My skin color doesn't define my role. My work defines my legacy. It was more than a catchphrase. It was the living translation of so many silenced stories that had finally found a voice. The reaction was immediate. Standing ovation, teary eyes, looks of admiration. And more than that, a collective sense of urgency. Something had to change. Amara's speech made front-page headlines, became a mural on university walls, and was cited in academic journals. But she didn't let fame get to her head. She continued her mission, now broader than ever, to help build fairer systems, where talent doesn't have to hide to be accepted. After all, it's these stories that become a compass for those still walking in the dark. And the most fascinating part? She never used the scandal as a springboard. She used it as a bridge, to inspire young black women, to challenge rigid judges, to re-educate entire institutions. With every new speech, every new project, she reinforced that the path of transformation is not just about courage, it's about consistency, about showing every single day that competence has no color, that authority is not born from titles but from impact. And in the end, the most powerful stories are the ones that teach more than they shout. What remained from that trial wasn't the judge's embarrassment, nor Amara's sudden fame. It was the lesson, a lesson that reached beyond courtrooms, into newsrooms, classrooms, and all the way to you, reading this story now. Because everyone at some point has underestimated or been underestimated, and the real difference is in how we respond. Amara didn't shout, didn't slam the table, didn't stoop down. She stood firm with what was most powerful, knowledge. And when knowledge meets purpose, it can't be ignored. Her story became a reference not because she retaliated, but because she taught. She taught that even when everything around you tries to diminish your presence, you can still hold your ground. And that, my friend, is worth more than 1,000 empty protests. It's a reminder that resistance isn't just about protesting. It's about occupying, remaining, and transforming. It's about showing that every time someone tries to belittle a story, what's really being exposed is the ignorance of those who judge before they listen. And so Amara closed that chapter as few would, with elegance, firmness, and without needing to strike back, because she knew that the justice that matters is not the one that screams, but the one that builds. And in the end, there is no weapon more powerful than being underestimated and still delivering excellence. And let me tell you, there's still a lot more to come in this story, because people like Amara don't stop when they win. They stop when they change the system. Now tell me, how many times have you dismissed a story just because you judged before you listened? How many people have crossed your path carrying immense wisdom, powerful life lessons, and you simply didn't see them? Maybe because they weren't dressed the way you expected. Maybe because their tone of voice didn't sound authoritative enough. Or maybe because the place where they were didn't match the image in your head of who deserves to be heard. We don't even realize it, but we keep repeating judgments that were taught to us, not chosen. And this happens all the time. In the streets, in businesses, in schools, in restaurants, on public transport. It happens when you cross the street to avoid someone who looks different. It happens when you distrust someone because their clothes are simple. It happens when you dismiss an opinion because it came from someone older, younger, or quieter. It happens when you think that only people who speak intellectually have something to teach. And at the end of the day, these small decisions shape the world we live in, a world where important stories go untold because no one had the patience or humility to listen. But do you know what the real danger is? It's not just missing the chance to learn from others. It's missing the chance to grow with them. Because every time you ignore a story, you block a connection. You choose silence when you could have chosen dialogue. You close a door when you could have opened a window. And it's exactly in that unlived space where ignorance thrives. Not the ignorance of those who don't know, but the ignorance of those who refuse to learn. Now think with me. What do you do when you hear a story that unsettles you? Do you share it and go back to your routine? Or do you stop and ask yourself, what does this say about me? Because the greatest power of a good story isn't to go viral. It's to turn you inside out. It's to make you face truths you've hidden under the rug. It's to make you rethink your actions, mend relationships, and remake promises. And that's not easy. It challenges your ego, your pride, your old certainties you thought were unshakable. But that's where transformation begins. Not in the video, not in the pretty speech, not in the applause. It begins in the discomfort, in that mental itch that keeps you up at night. It begins when you realize you're doing exactly what you once criticized and decide to change. It begins when you acknowledge that prejudice doesn't only live in institutions. It lives in our daily choices, in how we treat the cleaning lady, the cashier, the elderly man at the bus stop. It begins when you decide that every person carries a story, and none of them deserve to be ignored. So now, what will you do with this knowledge? File it away? Turn it into a like and nothing more? Or will you use it as a mirror to reflect on who you've been and who you still can become? Because it's no use claiming to believe in justice, empathy, and equality if, in your daily life, you only listen to those who have the same titles, clothes, or last names as you. That's not justice. That's a comfort zone, and no real change comes from a comfortable place. You know what would be revolutionary? Leaving here today willing to truly listen, willing to ask more and judge less, willing to look into the eyes of those who have always been invisible to you, willing to hear a story all the way to the end, without interrupting, without correcting, without doubting, just listening. Because sometimes all someone needs to bloom is to be embraced, and sometimes all you need to change is to listen to a story with an open heart. And it doesn't have to be anything grand. You can start small. You can start at home by listening to that aunt who's always interrupted. You can start at work by paying attention to the intern no one takes seriously. You can start on the bus by greeting someone who's tired of being treated like they're invisible. You can start wherever you are with whatever you have, because empathy doesn't require a degree. It requires presence. And if this video touched you in any way, don't let it end here. Comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Talk about it at your next gathering. Question your own behaviors. Because as long as we don't turn indignation into action, prejudice remains intact. And worse, it remains disguised as normal. We're always saying we want a better world, but that world starts with the choices we make every day. It starts when we decide that every human being carries a story that deserves respect. It starts when we understand that appearance says nothing about character. It starts when we look beyond the surface and choose to see what really matters. Someone's dignity, journey, dreams, pain, and victories. And you know what's most beautiful? When we start listening to stories with care, we begin to see ourselves in them. We realize that behind all our differences, there are so many similarities. That deep down, everyone wants to be heard, embraced, respected. And that connection, that silent bond born of listening, has the power to heal old wounds, to restore trust, to build bridges where there were only walls. So if you've made it this far, I invite you. Don't just be someone who got the message. Be someone who lives the message. Because the world doesn't change with opinions. It changes with actions. And every small action of yours could be the beginning of a new story. A story where no one is judged by their cover, where everyone has the right to tell their version, where listening matters more than judging, and where empathy is the rule, not the exception. So subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and join us as we keep learning from stories that challenge, awaken, and above all, transform.